Have you ever just discovered a game that you've never heard of or seen before, despite the fact that it's been around for quite a while, and your gut reaction is just, yo, I want to play that? And so even with zero recommendations, reviews, or any real info, you jump in head first with, at best, a few screenshots and maybe like 30 seconds of gameplay footage to go off of. Personally, I get this urge quite a bit, and while picking games this way can certainly lead to the occasional stinker, it's also resulted in me finding some of my favourite series to date. I remember during a Steam sale once having to pick between Trails in the Sky and Record of the Agris War, thinking that they both looked kinda similar to Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. I ended up picking Trails in the Sky, and while it was definitely nothing like FFTA, I fell in love with it really quickly. And now Trails in the Sky the Third is tied with Kingdom Hearts 2 for being my favourite game of all time. Another example would be Sin and Punishment, because the concept of there being a good game on the N64 seemed impossible, and yet here we are. And I had this same sudden desire to play Crystalis the first time I saw it as well. I'd never even heard of it before until it was announced to be part of the Nintendo Switch Online service, which, to be fair, does make sense, since it came out 7 years before I was even born, and wasn't even released in my country. I think what really took me by surprise though is how much it really didn't look like it belonged on the NES. See, if you've watched my other videos, then you should know that I really like RPGs, and I can appreciate older games, but for the most part, what can be considered the silver age of RPGs is kind of my limit. Unfortunately, there's just something about that 8-bit era that I just can't get along with, barring a very few number of exceptions. Stuff like the original Zelda is kinda slow and clunky, but it's well enough designed that I can still enjoy it. My first impression of Crystalis, however, was actually quite different. The gameplay was moving at a pretty fast rate, and you could actually walk diagonally as well. And not to mention, I could barely see any of that patented Famicom flicker. It makes sense considering it came out towards the end of the console's lifecycle, but needless to say, it had my curiosity. Fast forward over a year of me telling myself that I'll eventually get round to it, and we get to now. The next 2 videos that I'm planning on doing will probably take a fair amount of time to get through, and I'm going back to work soon, which means that I need to get as much ahead of my schedule as possible. So I thought to myself, yeah, let's do a NES game. It will expand my portfolio out a bit, and I'll be able to beat it in like a single setting. I mean, it's only going to be what, like 3, 4, 10 hours? Wow, they really packed a lot into you, didn't they? Anyway, it's been about 500 words now, and I've still not actually talked about the actual game yet, so let's jump right in, shall we? The story of Crystalis, or Godslayer, Sonata of the Faraway Sky in Japan, begins in the far-off future of 1997, where some dumb kid has been playing those violent video games again and has caused a global nuclear fallout, resulting in countless deaths and hundreds of mutated monsters to roam the Earth. To prevent any future cataclysms from occurring, all of mankind's technology has gathered into a single floating tower to watch over the land and prevent the evil of video games from forming again, while the people on the surface have returned to a more primitive medieval style of life, relying on magic instead of science. Skip forward 100 years, and a man known as Emperor Dragon seeks to conquer the planet with a military force created by combining both magic with the forbidden technology of the past. This is where our hero Chadol Biston steps in, or rather steps out of a cryogenic sleep, with no memories of who he is or where he's from, you know, like a good protagonist. Guided by 4 sages, he sets out to gather the 4 elemental swords of wind, fire, water and thunder in order to combine them to create the legendary sword Crystalis. It's all pretty basic by the numbers story stuff for a JRPG, but the post-Fallout setting is actually fairly interesting. Unfortunately, however, the technology side of things barely rears its head until the very end of the game, and I was kind of fond of the whole magic versus technology thing it set up, but I guess it just wasn't meant to be. The game instead normally focuses on fighting the mutated monsters of the surface with your collection of swords. Chadol only possesses a stabbing attack, but is able to charge up a projectile with each sword by standing still. Level 1 and Level 2 are just some very basic projectiles, but Level 3 magic has much more powerful effects at the cost of some MP. There's not a ton of variations in the enemies. Even the ones that aren't just recoloured sprites usually share the same properties as others, but they can vary in movement speed and patterns depending on the enemy. Most of them can only damage you via contact damage, but there are a few with some actual attacks and projectiles, and a number of them can inflict status effects as well. Things like paralysis will stop you from using your sword magic, while petrification will freeze you in place for a brief moment. It's poison, however, which is the true bane of my existence, as it is a death sentence. It will not go away until you've rested it in or used an antidote. So if you don't have a fast travel item or some way to cure it, then you're not going to survive for long. One thing the game does try and do to vary things up a little bit is by making certain enemies immune to certain sword types. This seems like a pretty good idea to diversify the bestiary, but the first 3 swords are all very similar outside of their level 3 spells, which feel way too overkill to use on standard enemies, especially when MP is better used to focus on healing. What ends up happening as a result is a lot of menu management where you're just constantly switching out swords that all feel pretty similar. And this gets especially annoying when you're fighting 2 enemy types close together that are only weak to a sword that the other one is immune to. Outside of those grievances though, the combat, while basic, is still pretty fun and fast paced, even when you have to stand still to charge up your magic, since as long as you keep holding the button down, you'll keep hold of that charge that you've built up, meaning that you can bob and weave in and out of those attacks and only stop during those small moments that you're safe. Or you can lame it out like I did. The sword's hitbox is rather thin, and I also think it's slightly skewed to your character's right, resulting in attacks looking like they've connected when they haven't. So using sword magic from afar is usually a much safer method. Then there's the RPG elements that are a lot more ingrained than that of a Zelda game, and it more closely mimics stuff like the East series. Leveling up is a thing, but after the first couple, the power increases from each level start to feel really incremental, with health and MP boosts being the only notable difference most of the time. A much more substantial way of increasing your defense as well as giving yourself passives is by the use of upgrading your accessories, armor and shield, the final of which being the Psycho armor and shield, and considering this is an SNK game and Athena even makes an implied cameo, I can only assume this is how you look during the final few bosses. What this does mean, however, is that if you want to survive, especially in the early game, you're going to need to be frugal with your cash, since grinding XP can only really do so much. Luckily, there is a shop glitch that allows you to buy certain things for free, which you can then sell, and after that, money no longer becomes a problem. Not that I would do anything like that, of course. I don't feel bad about any of that though. Like Zelda and the earlier East titles, there are various points in the game that require certain items to progress. The thing that bothers me about this in Crystalis, however, is that there's several solutions throughout the game that just involve buying an item to undo a problem. It's not really a major offense, but in the early game, you're picking up chump change, and that money is really precious, as it gives you the ability to not die, but you have to use that money to buy an alarm clock to wake someone up so you can go through a cave. And even when you do exploit the game to give yourself way more money than you need, it can still be irritating going to a place and then finding out that you need to bring a certain item with you that you didn't buy at the shop earlier, so you have to trek all the way back to get it. But in all fairness, outside of these areas where you need to buy something to continue exploring, the adventuring side of the game is actually pretty good. The game does start off fairly linear, but it opens up around about halfway through, with you needing to backtrack and use later game abilities to open up new paths, as well as a variety of different optional secrets that you can find as well. There are a few points throughout the adventure where the route forward can be a little bit obtuse at times, but there is a pretty good hint system in the form of using telepathy to speak to the 4 sages. As I mentioned before, in general the game does feel and play a lot better than a typical NES game really should. But it definitely has some cracks that begin to show the more you play through it. Sprite work for characters and monsters is all pretty good, even within the limits of what the NES can achieve, it works pretty well, and some of the bigger, fancier boss battles have some really nice sprite work to show off. And the environments and level design are also quite nice. When Crystalis feels like it wants to be interesting. There's really nice areas like the swamp or the floating tower where the scenery is really good for a NES game. There are also, however, a lot of really generic looking caves that you need to explore, as well as various recolored castle areas. I can only assume that this is probably due to space limitations, but it does make the game a little bit visually tiring. And then there's also stuff I mentioned before, like the Famicom flicker, which doesn't show up too often, but is present when enough things enter the screen at once. I think the way that they reduced it as much as they did was by using some pretty clever optimization techniques. For example, a lot of things at the edge of the screen do not render in right away, and instead just mirror the opposite side of the screen. This results in things like when running from left to right, the right side of the screen will have things like water and trees appear and then quickly disappear as you go along. It's not something that really ever bothered me at any point, and if it is in fact there to stop, slow down and flicker, then it's a really clever way of getting rid of it. But it certainly is a visual quirk of the game, so I figured I'd mention it. Another thing is there seems to be this sort of static just above the game's hood at all times, and after paying some close attention to it, it actually seems to be one of the game's MIDI tracks being visible for some godforsaken reason, as you can see it move in sync with the music, but nevertheless it's here to stay. Speaking of the game's music, I mean, it's there. I don't really know what else to say. I didn't really feel anything from it throughout the entire game. There's not really a single track that I'd say I enjoyed, but it's by no means bad. Like, it's just kind of there, which is fine, I guess. Overall, Crystalis was unfortunately not the glowing hidden gem that I was hoping it would be, but it was definitely a pretty fun time, and it can join the few titles in the list of 8-bit games that I actually enjoy, which I still think is a pretty impressive feat in its own right. There was a Game Boy Color port that came out about a decade later that changed and added a few things here and there, but it seems like it's widely accepted that it's the lesser version of the game. It's a shame though, really. I think that Crystalis' ambition really would have been better suited for a SNES title. I mean, had it been released a few years later on a 16-bit console, or gotten some sort of port or remake to the GBA or something, I think this game would have really shined. Using stuff like the extra buttons to be able to quickly rotate through which sword you're using, or assign more than one spell at a time, would be a great boon to the game. Not to mention what they could have done with the improved visuals. I mean, having that sort of fantasy setting clashing with the sort of modern day / sci-fi post-apocalyptic setting, like, would have generated a really powerful aesthetic. But in the end, I guess it doesn't really matter. I did still, for the most part, enjoy what we did get, and I'm glad I played it, and really that's all I can ask for. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. I really feel like I'm definitely coming on a lot. I've definitely got to a point where I'm pretty confident with everything I'm putting out now. I'm also feeling pretty confident just in general with like how I'm working, and like, you know, I'm getting videos out a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently, which is nice. I do apologise for like the borders around the NES games on Switch. It's they're not great. I'm also trying to be a bit quiet for this end slate bit because like people are sleeping. But yeah, like, subscribe, you know, that usual stuff, and do tell me like in the comments down below if there's anything you think I can improve on, because I definitely want to get better. Like, I've hit a point where I feel confident in everything that I'm doing, like I said, but like there's always room for improvement, so yeah, definitely. I'm really looking forward to the next 2 videos that I'll be doing. I've also had another idea for another Rambling with Craft, so you know, that will be hopefully pretty fun. But yeah, until then, see you later.